The snow outside the Blackwood Ski Resort did not just cover the ground. It entombed the secrets of the Cunningham family. Arthur Sterling lay dead in the master suite, his life extinguished long before the first morning light could pierce the heavy mountain mist. He arrived to expose us, yet he became the final piece of evidence in a puzzle that spanned generations. Every member of my bloodline carried the weight of a secret murder, and I was no exception. We lived behind walls of prestige, but beneath the polished mahogany and velvet curtains, the truth was a rotting foundation. I stood in the quiet of that room, watching the moonlight trace the edges of a life cut short by calculated betrayal. Looking back, the signs were etched into the very floorboards of the resort, waiting for someone to connect the dots between our inheritance and our sins. Welcome to Swasti Diaries, where we peel back the layers of deception that defined my family's legacy. That night, the air felt thick with the residue of a struggle that left no room for innocence. We were not just a family. We were a collection of predators bound by a deed that was never meant to be found. The investigation that followed was not merely about finding a killer. It was about surviving the truth that lay hidden in the dark. Before we examine the forensic impossibility of his death, we must ask, who stood to gain the most from his silence in this frozen, isolated tomb? The air inside the Blackwood Ski Resort did not merely chill the lungs. It held the static charge of a house waiting for the truth to collapse. Arthur Sterling was not an invited guest. He was a professional, a man whose life was measured in billable hours and the acquisition of damaging secrets. He arrived with a briefcase full of leverage, yet he never left the master suite. When I discovered him, the room remained locked from the inside, a classic impossible scenario that defied the logic of the mountain air. Why would a man who lived by the rule of transparency die in a room that allowed no exit? My uncle Julian always insisted that our legacy was untouchable, but his frantic attempts to scrub the family history told a different story. Every creak of the floorboards under my weight felt like a betrayal of the bloodline that sustained us. We were trapped in a cycle of suspicion where the inheritance deed served as both our salvation and our shackle. The investigation began with a singular, glaring contradiction. The victim held a list of our most guarded failures, yet the document appeared untouched, resting precisely where he had fallen. If he was murdered to silence him, why was the evidence left behind? This question burned through the silence of that pre-dawn hour. We stood on the precipice of ruin, and as I looked at the scattered remnants of his research, I realized that the killer had not just committed a crime. They had choreographed a masterpiece of misdirection, leaving us to tear ourselves apart while the real thief remained in the shadows. The blizzard outside the Blackwood Ski Resort intensified, sealing us within the lodge like a tomb of glass and timber. I stood in the threshold of the master suite, my breath hitching as the reality of the scene settled into the cold air. Arthur Sterling lay in a position that felt orchestrated, a grim pantomime of an old family secret that only the three of us, Julian, Clara, and I, were supposed to know. The body was positioned with the head facing the northern window, mirroring the stance of the statue in our grandfather's study, a detail that sent a jolt of recognition through my veins. Yet, the absurdity of it was absolute. How could a stranger, someone who only recently infiltrated our lives, know the specific private symbolism of our family's darkest history? I scanned the floor, my eyes locking onto a discarded leather glove near the radiator. It was damp, evidence of a hurried departure into the storm, but it belonged to no one in this house. The contradiction was immediate and suffocating. The room was locked from within, the window latches were rusted shut by years of mountain frost, and yet the evidence suggested an intruder had come and gone with the grace of a ghost. I leaned down, the floorboards groaning under my shifting weight, and noticed a series of asymmetrical footprints leading toward the balcony. They were uneven, deep on the left, shallow on the right, a distinct rhythmic limp. I looked at the fireplace, then back at the door. If the killer had exited through the balcony, how did they manage to lock the heavy deadbolt from the outside without leaving a single trace of force on the brass mechanism? The air in the room grew heavy, not with ghosts, but with the suffocating weight of betrayal. I reached into the pocket of the victim's jacket, my fingers trembling slightly as I pulled out a folded, ink-stained parchment. It was a list, a comprehensive, terrifying index of the Cunningham family's most protected transgressions. Every entry was precise, documenting dates and figures that even I had forgotten. This was not the work of an outsider. It was a dossier compiled by someone who sat at our dinner table, someone who knew exactly where the cracks in our foundation lay. The contradiction gnawed at me. If Arthur Sterling was hired to investigate us, he had clearly been fed this information from within. I looked again at the asymmetrical footprints trailing toward the balcony. They were not merely a path of exit. They were a signature of a specific physical frailty that haunted our bloodline. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. Julian's limp was a calculated ruse, a performance of infirmity he wore like a cloak, but these prints suggested a true, agonizing imbalance. I turned the list over, the light from the dying embers of the fireplace illuminating a faint, handwritten note on the back, a date that coincided perfectly with the night of the inheritance deed's disappearance. The suspect list narrowed, yet the logic demanded an impossibility. If the killer left through the balcony, how did they bypass the heavy rusted deadbolt that remained firmly locked from the inside? The answer lay hidden in the mechanics of the door itself, a detail I had overlooked in my initial panic. How could a locked room tell a lie? The deadbolt remained fully engaged, yet the balcony door stood open, a physical impossibility that defied the logic of the crime scene. I examined the mechanism again, searching for the telltale signs of a bypass, but the brass plate sat undisturbed against the door frame. It was then that the true nature of the victim's mission became clear. Arthur Sterling was not investigating a simple theft. He was digging into the silence that surrounded our family's history. A review of his recovered dental records, cross-referenced with the cold case archives from the winter of my father's disappearance, revealed a link that shattered my composure. The victim possessed a specific, rare dental bridge that matched the description of a man seen fleeing the scene of my father's accident decades ago. This was not a random hire. Arthur Sterling had been hunting the truth about my father for years, and he had finally cornered it inside these walls. The blackmail list in his pocket was merely a secondary objective, a tool to force the hand of the person who had orchestrated the cover-up. If Arthur had been tracking the truth about my father, he would have known that the inheritance deed was the key to the entire deception. My sister, Clara, had been obsessed with that document, but could she have orchestrated a murder to protect a secret that was already buried in the past? The realization hung in the freezing air, heavy and absolute. Looking back, the house felt like a labyrinth of carefully constructed lies. I spent the hours after the discovery mapping the whereabouts of my family, tracing their steps through the suffocating silence of that night. Uncle Julian claimed he remained in the library, drowning his anxieties in vintage scotch, yet his fireplace logs were cold by midnight. He lacked the typical residue of a man who had spent hours tending a flame. Then there was Clara. She insisted she was in the West Wing, preparing for her early morning departure, but the guest suite door was locked from the outside, a detail that made no sense if she had been inside as she claimed. The inconsistency was jarring. If she were truly in her room, why secure the door against her own exit? I reviewed the timeline of their movements. Between the hours of 10 and 2, the house became a stage for invisible actors. Julian's alibi relied on the silence of the staff, yet the staff were all accounted for in the servant quarters. Clara's story crumbled under the weight of a single physical truth. The master bedroom key was found in her coat pocket, despite her insistence that she had not entered the suite since dinner. The web of motives tightened. Each of them possessed a reason to keep Arthur Sterling quiet, but the precision of the crime suggested more than just a panicked reaction to a discovery. It suggested a calculated removal of a threat that had been festering for years. I sat in the dark, watching the shadows stretch across the floor, wondering which of them had the cold resolve to execute such a plan while the rest of us slept. The fireplace in the library had been cold for hours, yet the hearth held a secret that defied the stillness of the room. I reached into the soot-stained bricks, my fingers brushing against the rough edges of a hidden compartment. Inside, I found a cache of letters, not personal correspondence, but a meticulous ledger of leverage. Each envelope contained a detailed account of a family member's transgression, written in Arthur Sterling's precise, clinical hand. These were the skeletons Julian had been hiding, but the sequence of dates revealed a chilling contradiction. The most recent letter was dated only 2 hours before Arthur's death, addressed to my sister Clara. It demanded the immediate return of the inheritance deed she had stolen from the archive, or the full blackmail index would be delivered to the local authorities. The timeline shifted instantly. If Clara was the one being blackmailed, her insistence on being in the West Wing was not a cover for her own movements, but a desperate attempt to destroy the very evidence that linked her to the theft. I stared at the letters, the ink still sharp against the yellowed parchment. The motive was no longer a vague shadow. It was a concrete, paper-thin reality. Clara had not just killed to protect her secret. She had orchestrated a complex web of redirection, hoping the focus would remain on Julian's past sins while she erased her own. The realization turned the library into a trap. I realized then that Arthur had never been a neutral investigator. He had been a catalyst, and his murder was the final violent act in a game Clara had been losing since the moment she took that deed. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur Sterling had not been a simple investigator poking into our family's history. He had been a mercenary, hired by the very person who now stood to gain the most from his silence. I turned the ledger over in my hands, noting the recurring payments wired from a private offshore account I recognized all too well. They originated from my own sister, Clara. The evidence was damning. She had used Arthur to dig up dirt on Julian and the rest of us, creating a smokescreen of scandal to keep the authorities preoccupied while she quietly secured the inheritance deed for herself. But the ledger contained one final, jagged entry that pulled the rug from under my feet. Arthur had grown tired of being a pawn. In his final weeks, he began to realize the deed was not just a piece of paper, but a map to an even deeper, darker secret, one that involved me. I looked at the desk, the scattered papers suddenly appearing like pieces of a puzzle I had been too blind to solve. If Clara had hired him to frame the family, who had Arthur been talking to in those final, desperate hours? I scanned the last page of his notes, my eyes tracing a series of coordinates etched into the margins. They pointed directly toward the old boathouse, a place I had not visited since that night. The question was no longer who killed Arthur, but how much of my own past had he uncovered before he drew his final breath. The coordinates led me not to a treasure, but to a shallow rusted cache beneath the boathouse floorboards. As I pried the wood upward, the smell of brackish water and stagnant mud filled the air. There, wrapped in oilskin, lay the deed to the entire Blackwood estate. It was not merely a legal document. It was a testament to the avarice that had defined the Cunningham legacy for decades. Arthur Sterling had been right to fear it. I stared at the yellowed parchment, realizing that Clara had not simply stolen a piece of paper. She had attempted to erase the entire family's claim to our own history. The motive was as ancient as the house itself. Unfettered greed, sharpened by the desperation of a crumbling social standing. Every payment Arthur received, every secret he unearthed, had been a calculated investment in her own future. She had played the part of the grieving sister while orchestrating a systematic dismantling of our family's reputation. The irony was suffocating. By framing our mother for the theft, she had ensured that no one would dare look toward the one person who knew exactly where the deed was hidden. I stood in the dark, the wind whistling through the rotted gaps in the walls, wondering if she knew I had found it. The silence of the boathouse felt heavy, pregnant with the weight of the truth. If I brought this document to the light, I would be exposing not just a thief, but the architect of our collective ruin. I tucked the deed into my coat, the cold edge of the paper pressing against my ribs, and prepared to confront the wreckage of my own bloodline. For days, the investigation centered on Julian. His history of extortion provided a convenient narrative, He had the motive, the reach, and the cold-blooded temperament to silence a man who knew too much. The police recovered his financial ledgers from the study, and for a brief window, the case seemed closed. It was a clean, linear conclusion that satisfied everyone. I watched the detectives catalog his belongings, convinced they had caught their killer. Yet, the logic remained incomplete. While searching the perimeter of the resort, I found a discarded leather glove tucked behind a stack of firewood near the service entrance. It was a high-end, bespoke piece, far too expensive for a man who had been burning through his savings to maintain a facade of wealth. More importantly, the glove was stained with a specific residue, the same industrial oil used on the boathouse winch. If Julian had killed Arthur, he would not have needed to access the boathouse mechanisms. The glove belonged to someone who had been there, someone who had struggled with the heavy iron bolts during the dead of night. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Julian had been a convenient scapegoat, a man whose own sins made him the perfect target for a frame-up. As I turned the leather over in my hand, I noticed a small jagged tear in the seam. It was not the work of a man fighting for his life. It was the mark of a calculated, deliberate act. The evidence did not point to the uncle. It pointed to someone who had access to the inner vault. The leather glove was merely a starting point. It demanded a physical reality that I had previously ignored. I returned to the perimeter of the resort, where the snow remained undisturbed by the morning maintenance crews. Using a high-intensity flashlight, I began to map the movement patterns surrounding the service entrance. The snow held secrets that the interior of the resort could not conceal. I found a sequence of tracks, a rhythmic, uneven impression left by heavy winter boots. The stride length was inconsistent. It was the signature of a person favoring one leg, a deliberate, dragging gait that indicated a long-term injury rather than a temporary stumble. My mind raced through the roster of the house. Julian walked with the steady, heavy gait of a man who spent his life in control. My mother, too, possessed a fluid, steady movement. But Clara, I recalled the accident from 3 winters ago, the shattered tibia that never quite healed correctly. The logic snapped into place with terrifying precision. The footprints did not just lead to the boathouse. They originated from the private study, the very room where the inheritance deed had vanished. The killer had not just framed an uncle. They had used the distraction of his blackmailing activities to mask their own physical limitation. I stood in the freezing dark, the beam of my light tracking the path of the perpetrator as they had returned from the scene of the crime. Every step was a confession. The murder was not an act of impulsive violence. It was a chore, completed with the cold, mechanical efficiency of someone who believed they were untouchable. The timeline of that night was not a chaotic frenzy, but a calculated sequence of movements. I looked at the security logs, noting the 2-minute gap in the feed, a deliberate loop programmed into the resort server at exactly 3:14 a.m. This was not a system failure. It was an internal bypass. The killer knew the precise moment the night watchman transitioned from the north perimeter to the central lobby. It gave them a window of exactly 120 seconds to bridge the distance between the private study and the service exit. I reconstructed the path, pacing it out myself in the freezing dark. The route required navigating the narrow ventilation crawlspace behind the main fireplace, a feat that would have been impossible for anyone without intimate knowledge of the architectural blueprints. As I re-examined the mud on the floorboards, I realized how they had bypassed the silent alarms. They had not tripped the magnetic contact on the door. They had entered through the secondary, non-monitored window, using a specialized tension wrench to hold the latch in place. It was a professional touch, one that suggested the killer had practiced the maneuver multiple times. The logic was undeniable. Every detail, from the timing of the server loop to the specific entry point, pointed toward a singular, cold-blooded necessity. They had to secure that inheritance deed before the morning audit. The murder was merely a logistical requirement, a silencing of the one man who had discovered the anomaly in the ledger. My sister had not just stolen an inheritance. She had orchestrated a masterpiece of misdirection, leaving a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly to the uncle, all while hiding in plain sight behind a mask of grief. The audio recording was not just a sequence of sounds, it was a map of betrayal. When I finally isolated the digital file from the resort's hidden backup server, the atmosphere in the room shifted. For weeks, the evidence had pointed toward my mother. Her handwriting was on the ledger, her access card had triggered the security logs, and her presence was documented in the lobby just moments before the alarm. But the audio revealed a different truth. I heard the distinct rhythmic clicking of a mechanical watch. A watch that belonged to my sister, Clara, not my mother. The recording captured a conversation I had never heard. A hushed dialogue between Clara and an unknown accomplice, discussing the placement of the very ledger that incriminated our mother. The realization hit with the cold weight of certainty. Clara had spent months meticulously weaving a web of false trails, using the mother's daily routine to mask her own movements. The most damning piece of evidence, the one that had supposedly solidified my mother's guilt, was a staged performance. I listened to the sound of a heavy door latch clicking into place, followed by the unmistakable asymmetrical gait of someone walking with a slight drag, a limp Clara had hidden from the family for years. The investigation had been a diversion from the start, a cruel game designed to protect the inheritance deed at the cost of our family's foundation. Now the final piece of the puzzle lay before me, and it did not lead to the study, but to the one person I had trusted to mourn with me. I found Clara in the library, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the damp chill of the mountains. She did not look like a killer. She looked like a woman who had spent a lifetime perfecting a mask. I laid the audio recorder on the desk between us, the red light blinking like an accusing eye in the darkness. She did not flinch. She did not reach for an excuse. She simply watched me with a terrifying, hollow composure that told me everything I needed to know. The inheritance deed had been her obsession. A piece of paper she believed was the key to a freedom that never existed. She had hired Arthur Sterling to investigate our uncle, knowing his reputation for digging up dirt, but she had manipulated the scope of his inquiry to lead him directly into a trap. When the investigation grew too close to her own theft of the deed, she silenced him. She used the asymmetrical gait she had painstakingly masked for years to frame the narrative, leaving behind the scuff marks and the leather glove, knowing the evidence would point anywhere but toward her. She confessed with a quiet, biting precision, explaining how she had moved the ledger to implicate our mother, calculating that our family's history of petty grievances would make the accusation stick. The betrayal was not born of sudden rage. It was a slow, deliberate erosion of trust. She had sacrificed Arthur, her own integrity, and our family's future for a document that was now rendered meaningless by her own confession. As the final words left her lips, the silence that filled the room felt heavier than any truth I had ever uncovered. There was no relief in the reveal, only the cold, hard realization of what we had become. The police arrived as the storm finally broke, their rotating blue lights painting rhythmic, hollow patterns against the frosted glass of the library windows. The house, once a fortress of secrets, felt suddenly fragile, its walls unable to contain the wreckage of our history. Clara sat in the back of a cruiser, a silent silhouette against the rain-streaked glass, while the officers gathered the remnants of her ambition, the ledger, the deed, and the audio evidence that had dismantled our lives. There was no grandeur in the conclusion, only the mechanical efficiency of justice stripping away the layers of pretense. I stood on the porch, watching the taillights fade into the mountain mist, realizing that the inheritance we fought to protect had become the very thing that erased us. My uncle's blackmail network crumbled the moment the investigators linked the ledger to his offshore accounts, proving that greed was the only language this family ever spoke fluently. I walked back into the library, the air still thick with the scent of damp paper and ozone, and extinguished the desk lamp. The darkness that followed was no longer a hiding place. It was a final cold clarity. We were a house of cards, and the wind had simply decided to blow. The truth provided no absolution, only the realization that some foundations are too rotten to ever be rebuilt. If you found this investigation into the shadows of the Cunningham legacy compelling, please subscribe to Swasti Diaries for more deep dives into the dark.